Yeah, turn it on.
Okay, in the book, there are, can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay. This is my aunt, this is the picture here. This is a picture when she was 14 years old. That's how old she was when she kicked the bomb into the. Here she is 18. She was 18 years old. She was killed February 4th, and this was just taken a few months before she was killed. Then I have. This is a photo of me. There you see the coal mine behind me. That's a coal mine, and this is me on my mom's shoulder. So that's during the war. Down here is a photo of my two brothers. That was when they already came back from the farm. That's a photo of my grandmother's wedding that grew up there. And my grandfather also had a Polish name, Kownacki. But he also changed it to a German name. My parents had no camera, so I have no photos of myself. That was my family, my mother, father, and my two brothers. This here was the farmhouse in East Prussia. It is still there today. My cousins still go there. For the first time last year, it's now in Poland. East Prussia was given after the war to Poland as restitution, war restitution. This is my aunt who was there, and this are two of my aunts that were taken in, my two brothers, and this is my little cousin. And this is my brother here, and those are my aunt whose farm it was, that is them. My book goes tonight, these are my sisters that were born in 1949. And this is a photo that I have after the war, when everything was bombed. People like after the war, of course, the winter was terrible. People had no food after the war because there was because there was no food, actually it was so severe that people starved to death. The winter of 1945 was one of the coldest. And people, because their houses were bombed, and during that time, if you learn that Germany at that time was divided into 4 zones. American zone, English zone, French zone, and Russian zone. The 4 Allied forces divided that. And you know where Berlin is here. East Germany started like this. And Berlin was in the middle of East Germany. But Berlin was split in half. East Berlin and West Berlin, because the Russians, and it was the capital of Germany. So Germany then, West Germany was French zone, American and English. When we came back from the evacuation that I talked to you before the little break, we had to walk back home, and we have to walk over rivers and over canals, and the bridges were all exploded, and some were exploded by German armies, and some were exploded in the east by the east. So the soldiers could not transport. Well, we had to go across there to get home. And what the men did is the bridges, they would fall into the canal or into the river like this. And I remember that we arrived at the first river that had the bridge collapsed, and we didn't know how to get across. But thank God we had men. They went and they felled some trees and put the trees across. I remember my dad carrying me across. They carried baby carriages up like this and across. That's what people do to help themselves. When we came back to my hometown, the war was not over yet. But when we came into our courtyard, somebody had broken into our house. And in those days, you couldn't go to the store and buy canned goods or frozen goods. That didn't exist. When you had a little garden, you canned them, and all our canned goods and all our potatoes were stolen. But before we left, and we had to let all of our chickens go because my father was afraid, didn't know when we would come back, and they would just starve to death. And we had no food, except my dad had some fodder that he was using to feed the chickens and the pig occasionally, and he had put it in the house. And that was like a special grain that he used for fodder. That wasn't humans didn't. And it was springtime when we came back. And in Germany, up that far north, you hadn't planted anything in the garden yet, and you couldn't buy any seeds. So we didn't have any chickens, we didn't have any food. So what did we live on? And eventually our sugar was gone and our salt was gone, and my mother would cook, and there was no meat. The milkman didn't come by anymore, the bread man didn't come by anymore, the vegetable man didn't come by, the fish man didn't come by anymore, and the stores were bombed. And I gave a presentation to a group of veterans, and many veterans and retired engineers from IBM. And they had me talk for a long time. And at the end, when I had a question and answer, and I said people would come back and leave the Russian zones because they would all come into Germany, and 12 million people left the Russian zone and came to the West. Where did they stay after the war? In the cities, in the bombed out houses. And the winter was so strong that they died of starvation because there was no food, and they died because they froze to death. And the people at night, in the morning, would go out and collect the corpses and put them in a warehouse because the ground was so frozen they could not bury them. And we had the fodder though. My mother would cook the fodder, just soak them overnight and cook it in the morning. And at first we still had a little sugar left, and then we have a little salt left, and then all that was just water. And I asked my brother, and I said, you know, how long did we eat that? And he said 9 months. 9 months, because for 9 months. And you know, it kept us alive. People didn't care, but other people just starved to death. And in that presentation to these engineers and those veterans, one of them, at the end of when I had a question and answer period, and he said, I have a contribution, not a question. I said, oh, good. He said, I was with the American Army that in Germany. We issued rationing cards. We put the German population on an 800-calorie diet. That's a starvation diet. And so people starved, and the stores didn't have food anyway. Even if you had rationing cards, you couldn't buy stores. We were lucky that my father he grew up on the farm. There's a photo of the farmhouse. He grew up on a farm down here in East Prussia, near the Czechoslovakian border, and he took the train there. And in those days, the trains were so full because people would go to the land and beg the farmers to give them food. Well, his sister still lived in the farmhouse where my dad grew up, and she gave him a hen. And the hen was just starting to build hen, and she gave him eggs. And so he brought the hen home and the eggs, and then she brooded, and he was just praying that there would be a rooster. Do you know why? Why?
There's no rooster that they can produce.
That's true. You needed the male rooster to fertilize the eggs, or they couldn't have male roosters and have new ones again. But when these little chicks finally we had one rooster and 6 chicks, but none of the neighbors had them, and we were so worried that they would be stolen. So we watched them carefully, and the rats from the ships that were broken in the canal would come in and eat the chickens. So we guarded them with our lives, literally. And the people were so starved. Eventually my father brought back some seeds and a few potatoes. And when you want to grow potatoes, actually if you cut them, you can put them in the ground, and if they have a little sprout, they sprout anyway. But when the potatoes ripened then in the fall, and people were still so hungry, more people were coming and were so starved, they would come and then steal the potatoes out of the ground. And when we went to church, our minister said, we had a new minister, the minister said, if a father steals to feed his children. That is not a sin. But our children in our street were also hungry. And at night they would go out and then guard our potatoes and our little bit of fruit that we had. Eventually, when our chickens laid eggs first, the little ones, we were allowed to eat them. When they got bigger, we weren't allowed to eat them because my father was hoping the other hens would then brood. And then my dad supplied the neighborhood with little how do you call them? The chickies, the little ones? The little, what do you call little hens? Little, they come out of an egg. Chicks. Oh, chicks. And give them to neighbors so they could have eggs. At one time he went back because we had no milk and there was a tuberculosis breakout. And my dad went back to the farm and he came back with a goat. And many of the kids had never seen a goat and they thought it was, like we called her Laura. And the goat then would have milk. And goat milk is very rich in fat. And we had a woman across the street that had tuberculosis. And but before we had the treat, my brothers were at the age where they were growing so fast. They were so hungry. My mother would get a bread and she would put marks on the bread and count how many pieces of bread she had so she knew how long we could eat as a family of 5 with one bread. She would mark it, and then sometimes one brother was always so hungry when he would go to bed, and I would sometimes see my mother, we would get 1 piece of bread a day, and then she would put the crust in her pocket sometimes, and my brother Jürgen would sometimes, before he went to bed, would beg, Mom, do you have something else to eat? She would give him her crust. And we had a crop behind the coal mine. There was, near the canal, there was a warehouse where they used to bring groceries in, and then the groceries were shipped to different parts of northern Germany. And my brothers knew about that. They were older. Boys are always a little bit exploratory. They found that. And they said, let's go and see if there's still food there. Well, we didn't know. The warehouse was surrounded by a barbed wire. And they said, we can make a hole. Let's go and see if we can't find some food. So we go through, we climb through the hole that they made, and we look in through, the windows were dirty to see if we could find food. All of a sudden, we hear a voice, what are you kids doing here? Look around, and they're American soldiers with cocked rifles. What are you doing here? Well, we're just seeing what's in there. Remember, we're just seeing what's in there. And I was supposed to have been there. My brother told me when I interviewed him, and I have no memory of that. And my writing teacher, I said, how is so important. These soldiers then said, come inside. And my brother said, he was shaking so bad, both my brothers were there, was shaking so bad, they were taken inside, and there were tables there, and they said, sit. And the soldiers were standing there with their rifles and just looked at them. All of a sudden they said, you guys hungry? I said, yes. So they made Spam and scrambled eggs and toast, and they fed them and gave them real milk. So there's a good story. Even though I lived in an English, there are lots of stories, the interaction then with the American soldiers, and so there are a lot of good stories and sad stories because the afterwars are still very, very difficult. I'm going to stop here. My book goes all the way, and I have to tell you what boys do after the war. They immediately, because we during the war were not allowed to play outside, it was too dangerous, my brothers would go and look for downed airplanes and bring home things, would take things from the airplanes and bring them home. They would find magnesium at one time and bring it home. And they were smart enough. I mean, did they have chemistry already at that age? I don't know. So anyway, they were magnesium sheets, and they cut them into pieces, and they put them up, and at New Year's Eve, in Germany, you always have fireworks to celebrate. And of course, there were no fireworks in 1945, the first New Year's Eve. So what they wanted to do, they wanted to make fireworks. So they took like an empty coffee can, punctured holes in it. They cut up the magnesium strips, put them in there, put a little strips of a newspaper underneath, And then they would put holes in them and put a wire around it. They would ignite the newspaper, and that would ignite the magnesium, and they would go like this, and it was like fireworks. They were sparking like fireworks. They wanted to do that for New Year's Eve, but one boy, some of the hot magnesium came out and ruined his eye, and he turned blind in the eye. So the police came by our house and said, "You can't let your kids do that." Well, it wasn't New Year's yet. My brothers went and found gypsum in the chemical plants, or whatever plant that was. Gypsum looks white. Chemically, gypsum is different chemical. I researched what kind of gypsum it was. They cut the gypsum into little pieces. They took beer bottles and put I think water, gypsum in here, the white gypsum. They put water and vinegar in there and left room. And then they took the beer bottle and shook it, and then that would have fog. It would have like gas. It would create a gas, and eventually so much gas, the beer bottles would explode. That's what we did for Christmas Eve for our fireworks then. But then again, a child was injured, and the police came and said, "You can't let your kids do that." Well, my brothers came home with big, empty shells and said, "Mom, a vase for you." And we actually put potatoes in there. So that's how the war went on. My book ends in 1949, when Germany had its first democratic election, when it had a new constitution, and in the constitution it said that Germany will never pick up weapons against another country again. With that, I'll end the presentation. As you know, the book goes much longer. It's very interesting to read. Even for you it would be interesting to read. So if you have any questions or learned something, let me know. Any questions? Yes?
Where did you get the name for your book?
Pardon me?
Where did you get the name for your book?
Oh, there's a chapter in my book that's a chapter, because even though you grow tomatoes, during a war, you still have bombs that come down. And the tomatoes were ripening, and I was a little 4-year-old. And the tomatoes, and my father grew extra tomatoes. It must have been 43 or so. And I went through the tomato plants, and we had a rare sunny day. And as a child, the plants were this tall, and I was this tall. And I looked up, and the tomatoes, the green tomatoes, had stars on them. And I thought they were so beautiful, so I picked them. I put them in I had an apron on, and I put them in my apron, and I took them in the house. My mother was hanging clothes outside, and I picked the others. And when she came home, she realized I had picked all the tomatoes. And it was supposed to be and that was a time when food was already rare. She was so upset. She spanked my bottom so hard. In those days when you did something wrong, you got spanking. And that was supposed to make you better. And honestly, I couldn't walk up the steps. She did a good job. I couldn't sit on a little bench because it hurt. But when she visited me in California, and I asked her about that, I said, "Do you remember that when I picked all the tomatoes?" And she said, "Ursula, and I gave you such a spanking, and the next day you went out and picked those that you left on the day before." So, I wanted to contrast that you have that kind of life in the war as a child, but you also have to worry about the drops bombing. And that's why I eventually came up with that title. So, anything else? Okay, yeah. Yes?
How old was your aunt when you were born?
My aunt? I had one aunt that was 9 years older, so she was 9 years. She was still in school. And the other one was probably 3 years older. And my mother came from a family of five daughters. Thank you. Okay, if you don't have any more questions, yes?
Who drew your drawing on?
I did. I had a photo. Now, the tomatoes here, this is supposed to be me, right? And this is actually a tomato plant from my backyard. But I had to put the tomatoes in red because everything was so green around that. I drew it. And how I did that, as you notice, these coke ovens there, they are not in scale. They are not to scale because when you take drawing lessons and you draw perspective, the buildings don't go this way, they go that way. You know, that's how it's, eventually they go, if you look down a street, it gets narrower and narrower, right? I did that on purpose because I wanted it to give the idea a child drew that, because I was 10 years old when this picture was taken, right? And I have so many memories from the war. And I drew this to scale, that one to scale. And those buildings were really the buildings. And I drew them on drawing paper, and then I scanned them in my computer, and I made them smaller and brought them into a Word file. And you can make, and then I took internet photos from B-17s, those are B-17s, and drew them to scale, because they were propellers, you know, because I want them to look real, and then scanned them and made the scanning smaller, and then I could move the planes around and the buildings around. I moved the buildings for the purpose of this picture around, and this slag heap is really a photo of a slag heap from another coal mine, because there were so many coal mines, you know. And of course the coal, that's what I did with the photo. And so I moved it around until I saw it the way I liked it.
What is the Slockheath?
The what?
The Slockheath? There's Slockheath, you said?
Oh, that is the dust that is left over from mining and from mining. It's
Okay.
all it's left over, and they use it for something else.
Interesting.
I
Both of my grandparents, on my mom's side, she's also a coal miner's daughter,
oh, okay.
and he died of black lung.
My father had 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So what that is that the people go into the mines, and they have their chisels, and they bring out the coal, and they're breathing all of that all the time, and it's
My
quite
dad
tragic.
said actually the law was for them to wear a mask, just like you see the mask in movies and that they used to wear. But he said you sweat so much, and then you can't see, because you know in those days nothing was as well designed. And so anyway, I found out when those see those three ovens there. Those were the coke ovens for the other. I couldn't remember, I could always see it looking out of my bedroom window, and all of a sudden it was gone. And I was already 1945, before we were evacuated. And I went online and it said, coal mine A mill bombed. And I found out what day it was bombed, how many airplanes were there, how many bombs were dropped, and how heavy they were. That's what you can find out now. You can do a lot of research. Now you get a lot of real true history in there, not just family. It's a history that you have learned, you will find there too. Yes?
Hi. When's the last time you've been back there, and what went through your head when you went through it? Have you visited since?
Yes, I mean my brother still lives there. The coal mines are all gone.
Okay.
The coal mines are all gone, and because it's very different, but it's still the same as the canal. I have stories in there how I learned to go swimming, how I learned swimming in the canal, and
Is that you?
must be mine.
Okay.
That's okay.
No. What goes to my mind, when I was writing this, I went back and excuse me, my husband is sick.
Sure.
Edward, are you sick? I'm still giving you a presentation at school. Do I need to come over right away? Edward? I need to go. I'm sorry.
Now, before you go, though, you can never, guests that come here, you can never leave without a box of power bars.
Oh, gosh.
And then also, here's a little gift for you as well.
Oh,
So,
thank you.
you're
Oh,
welcome.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. And you're the teachers or board?
I'm a swim coach.
I'm a school board member in Morgan Hill, and I was Kristen's ASB leadership teacher when she was in ninth grade.
Oh, my God.
He is my most favorite teacher ever, and he's an incredible mentor and one of my favorite people that's ever been through my life that I've ever had the pleasure to
And I
know.
want to thank you, that was an excellent presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, you're the youngest audience I've had. And I mean, I've given 50 presentations from mostly men's groups, you know, and you had very good questions, and I could see that you already knew a lot. So I didn't get to talk about the two ladies that were the Jewish, there's a story about that too. But
Yeah.
you just can't talk everything. I do need to go home.
So,
excuse me.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Okay, it is journal time. Okay. It is journal time.
One pizza for me, one
Reflection.
pizza for everybody else.
Yes, and then half page. And then it is pizza time. Not for you, but for 2-3 for their awesome Spirit Week incredible moments. Good job, Reichmuth.